When you work in Excel, you may find that the if function is precisely what you need. However, it only tests for one criteria. Well, what happens if you have more than one condition that you want to test for? Oh, well, that answer's easy enough. What you do is add in more if functions, and so your formula can have multiple if functions all together to help you figure out, if I have this condition, I'm going to do this, but if I have this condition, I'm going to do this other thing. Hi, I'm Terry, one of the Consumer Technology Specialists for Mid-Continent Public Library, and we are going to look at some examples of formulas that have multiple ifs, which is called nested ifs. As we look at our first example today, we can see that it has 16 days worth of numbers, and those numbers represent the high temperatures for that particular day, with the idea that we would create a temperature afghan or temperature quilt. And on the right, just for sort of our own amusement, we've decided to put in some sort of a label for each one of those days. If the temperature was below 50, we're going to say it was cold. And if it's 50 and above, we're going to say, oh, it's comfy. So they may be a little extreme with just cold and comfy, but that's what we've decided to do, at least for our first attempt. We'll go to D2 and then go up to the tabs above the ribbon and go about 3 over from Home, which is Formulas. And then I happen to know that because we're testing for a true and a false, that is an if statement, and if can be found under the logical group. So we'll click the drop down and go to if. So what is our logical test? Well, our logical test is going to start here with B2. We're going to test for B2, and we're going to say, all right, if it is less than 50, and I can either type in the 50 or I can put in a cell reference for the 50. So in this first example, I'm just going to type the 50. And then from there, I need to say what to do if that is a true statement. So if the value is true, if B2 is less than 50, I can type cold according to my chart, and because I'm typing a word, I need to put that in quotes. Or I could add in the cell reference here of I4, and it's really my choice what I decide to do. But what happens if it's not less than 50? Well, that value is, of course, false, and it says right here that that is comfy. And again, I put that in quotes and say, okay. And then I get my first answer. I'll find the fill handle and click and drag down. And now I have some sort of a label for each one of these days. And it just becomes really evident very quickly that while day 1 is cold, if we look at this, the temperatures right here in day 2, 3, and 4 are comfy. Day 5 and 6 are cold. Day 7 and 8 and 9 are all above 50. So again, they are comfy. But day 10, 11, 12, clear down to day 14 are all cold. And then we see right here at day 15 and 16, they're not only comfy, they're kind of warm. But it's very easy to see then how this could help us define some of the cell contents as we create our spreadsheet. But here's the thing, I only had 2 options here, cold or comfy. What happens if we have more than 2 options? Now let's look at this same data, but if you look at my chart on the right, I now have the temperatures divided into 3 sections. So if it's below 40, it is cold. If it's between 40 and 69, it's comfy. And if it's 70 and above, ooh, I love today. So what happens is, as I look for true or false, I could essentially have two true statements and a false statement. How do I handle that? Well, the answer is I nest the ifs. So let's see how that would work. Let's go to D2, and I'm already on the Formulas tab, and I'm just going to go to Logical and down to If. And what is my first logical test? Well, my first logical test is that B2, if it's less than, and this time, instead of typing in a number, I'm going to put in a cell reference, and I'm going to click on H6. Now, what is the value if that is true? So, if B2 is less than 40, well, that's a burr. And I'm just going to type that in. And what is the value if false? Well, I have a choice between comfy and I love today, so I need to address that in just a second, because I realize as I look at my statement here, I do have something I need to be careful about. And that is, as I look at my logical test, if I look at B2, yeah, well, that's all the temperatures. So as I copy this formula down column D, I want to refer to B2 and then B3 and then B4 and B5, etc. That B2 without any kind of absolute reference is true. However, H6, that 40 value, that needs to remain exactly as 40 and nothing else. So what I can do is come over here and click in front of the H. When I press the F4 key on my keyboard, it adds a $sign in front of the H and a $sign in front of the 6, which means as I copy my formula, and it doesn't matter if it's down or to the side, don't change that reference to H and don't change the reference to 6. So I'm always talking about 40 degrees. Now that I have that, I have my first statement, my first test. I have what the value is if true, but what happens if that's false? Well, what I need to do is come over to the left of the formula bar to the name box, and look at this, it changes to if. I'll click on if. When I come back to that dialog box, it has changed to a blank dialog box. And just so I can make sure that I'm correct, when I look at the formula bar, it has put in my equals if B2 less than H6, and if that's true, it's burr, but it's added in another if, and it's simply ready for me to put in the logical test. All right, so what my logical test is going to be, if B2 is less than, well, let's see, we tried 40 degrees, but now let's go with 70 degrees in H9. What is the value if that is true? Well, that is comfy, and again in quotes. But if that is false, if B2 is not less than 70, then it is I love today. I need to double check my logical test, and I know that that H9 needs to have an absolute value, so I'm going to go to F4 and press it so that I can be sure that that reference to 70 degrees doesn't change. Now I'm going to click OK, and I get burr for the 20 degrees. I'm going to find the fill handle and click and drag down, and let's see what kind of answers we get. Let's do some testing here to make sure we are correct. Let's see, 52, which is in the comfy zone, is showing up in row 3 as comfy. The 72 right below that is greater than the 70 here in H. And so, yay, we have I love today. That is also correct. Then we have a whole lot of comfies as we look at that, and they are all greater than 40, but less than 70. And then we have two more really, really cold days in day 12 and 13. So they are less than 40 degrees. They're showing up as burr. And then we have the last 2 days on the end that warmed up considerably, and I love today. And so we have our first nested if with just a regular if and then one more condition on top of that. But what happens if we need to do more? Well, let's go figure that out. As we look at our next example, we can see that over on the right, where I have the degrees, that we have 4 options. How will that look? Well, we're going to basically write the same kind of condition, but we're just going to nest one more layer. All right, so we need to go to logical and if. And our first condition is really not going to change too much. We're going to say if B2 is less than, and where is our first break over here in our chart? Well, it's H5, 30 degrees. And by now we know that we need to click just in front of that H and press the F4 key on our keyboard. And what is the value if it's true? Well, it is still burr. But what if it's false? Well, we have 3 possibilities of false, don't we? Well, we'll go over to the name box and select if, and we get a blank dialog box. What are we going to test for this time? Well, we're going to test for if B2 is less than, and the next break was here in H7. We'll again click in front of the H, press F4 on the keyboard. What is the value if true? Well, less than H7 is coats. But what happens if the value is false? Well, we still have 2 possibilities. One is sweaters and one is yippee. So we need to go back over to the name box, click on if. What is our logical test? Well, is B2 less than, let's see, we've tested for H5 and H7. So here we are at H10. We'll again click in front of H10, press F4 to put in our absolute reference. What is the value if that's true? Well, this says sweaters. But what if it is false? Well, yippee, warm weather. And we'll click OK. And then we're going to click and drag on that fill handle. And let's see what we get this time. Let's test to make sure that we are accurate. Starting at the top, we can see that 20 degrees is still burr. 52, 72, and 52 is sweaters, which is exactly right. A little bit colder weather then at 43 and 45 is coats, which is absolutely correct. Let's come down and look for 82 and 92 here at the bottom. Yippee. It's greater than 80. And so that worked out really well. And let's just click on one of those formulas so we can see how this looks. I'm testing B2 for H5, B2 for H7, B2 for H10, and then finally I can kind of see true and false. Also notice that each time I do a test, I have a left paren, and then the number of ending parens, right parentheses, needs to match the number of left ones. So you don't have a kind of orphaned pair. you always have the same number of left parentheses as you have right parentheses. And so we have done a nested if with 4 conditions. Well, can we do more? Actually, we can do up to 64 conditions, but let's do one more. In our next example, I've kind of narrowed down some of those ranges within the degrees. So over here on the right, too cold is now just really 0 to 19. And then coats is basically in the 20s and 30s. Sweaters is in the 40s to 60s. 70s and 80s are just right. And 90 to 100 and above is hot. All we need to do is figure out how we're going to start our logic and then nest our ifs. So starting here in E2, we're going to go back up to the Formulas tab, go to the Logical group, click on the drop-down and select if. And our first test, just as usual, is that we're going to say, okay, is B2 less than H4? And we know that we need to click in front of the H, press the F4 on our keyboard so that we have an absolute reference. I've noticed that there's some sensitivity with some laptops and keyboards and whatnot. And so you may need to type in those dollar signs if the F4 key doesn't work for you, but hopefully it does. Well, what is our value if true? If B2 is less than H4, darn it, it is too cold. So in quotes, too cold. Now what is the value if false? Well, we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 different false values that we need to kind of test for. We can't just choose one of those sort of arbitrarily. So we need to go to the name box, click on if, and here is our next empty dialog box where we will test for B2 less than, and our next choice here in our chart is H6. We'll again press F4 as we click in front of the H to make that an absolute reference. What is the value if true here? Well, if it's less than 40, it means coats. And if it is false, well, that still leaves us sweaters just right and hot, so we need to go back to the name box. Click on if. What is our next logical test? Well, if B2 is less than, and from here, let's see, we tested for 20 and 40, so I think we're at 70 now, H9. We'll click in front of the H, press the F4 key. What is the value if true? Sweaters. But what is the value if false? Well, we still have 2 possibilities for false. So we'll go back to the name box, select if. What is our test now? Well, it's B2 less than, and this time we're going to go to H11. Again, we're going to click in front of the H11, press F4 to get the absolute reference. What is the value if it's true? Let's see, we're going to say just right. That is my favorite kind of weather. But what if it's false? We finally only have one false choice, and that is, I think I'm going to make this in caps, hot. And then click OK. So at the top, we know that in E2, that is just too cold, but as we come down with our fill handle, let's look at our options here and double check what we have found out. So let's see, 52 degrees is sweaters, and that fits in with our chart just fine. Now, the next choice here is 72 in day 3, just right. And as I look at my chart, it is just right. This next piece is, wow, kind of surprising. But I have 52, 43, 45, 50, 57, 55, 48, 43. And yes, all of those fit within this sweaters group, and so that is correct as well. Well, we do have some coat weather here, it looks like. Right here, 36 degrees, 34 degrees, and yes, that is less than 40, so that test worked just fine. And then, of course, what is a little interesting is in day 15, 82 degrees is just right, and that's the way I divided up those temperatures in my chart, so just right is correct. And then finally, 92 degrees is hot. We have looked at 5 different divisions of this chart, and I've been able to write ifs that work with each one of those. Isn't that just amazing in how you can really work with your spreadsheet to come up with the answers that you need? So far, we have been testing for B2 being less than a value in a cell. And that may be perfectly logical for you and you feel like you really understand how I derived those answers. But it could be that you would prefer to use basically the opposite logic. So let me show you how that would work in case that makes even better sense to you. So how we do this is I have the same chart that we just used where we have the 5 divisions of the different temperatures, and then starting just to the right of our day 1, what we're going to do is go back to the logical group and go to if, and we're still going to test B2. But this time we're going to test if it's greater than or equal to H11. So I'm working backwards. Now we do know that what we need to do is go to the keyboard and press the F4 key to make that H11 an absolute reference. And if that is the case, then if B2 is greater than or equal to H11, we know that that is hot. And then, what if it isn't greater than or equal to H11? Well, we have 4 possibilities for false, so we need to go to the name box where we pick up if, and then we'll go to the next logical test. Well, we'll go back to B2, and again, we're going to test for greater than or equal to, but this time we're going to test for H9. I'll click in front of the H and press the F4 to give that an absolute reference. And then what if that is true? Well, we're going to put in quotes, just right. What if that is false? Well, we've tested for basically 70 and 80 degree weather. So now we need to look at what would be false. Well, that's sweaters, coats, and too cold. So we have 3 options. Well, we need to go back to our name box, click on if, and do another test. So what is our logical test? Well, is B2 greater than or equal to H6? Again, I'll click in front of the H, press the F4. What is the value if true there? Well, sweaters. But what if the value is false? Well, I still have 2 choices here. Is it coats or too cold? So I need to go back to the name box, click on if, and do one more test. All right, is B2 greater than or equal to, in this case, H4? I'll click in front of the H, press the F4 key. What if it is? Well, that makes it coats. What if it is false? Finally, we only have one option here, too cold. And now we can click on OK. And we will find our fill handle and click and drag down, and let's look at this and do some testing to make sure that our thinking was accurate. So starting here in B2, it says 20 degrees is coats. And we said greater than or equal to, so that's right. Coats, 20 degrees. 52 degrees here. Sweaters, let's see. Yep, over here on the right, sweaters is correct. Our next option, 72 degrees, just right, according to our chart. That is absolutely correct. Then I see a whole lot of sweater weather here, so let's check all that out. Because we have, let's see, 52, 40s, the 50s again, the 40s, and we said that sweaters were going to be in the 40s, 50s, 60s, so that is absolutely correct as well. Then we have in the 30s, coats here, and looking at my chart, that is correct. We have another sweater, we have another just right, so let's look at 92 here, our last choice, as hot, and that works out as well. So this then, as we look at our formula bar, is just the opposite logic. We're testing for greater than or equal to as opposed to less than, but still that works out just fine. For our last example, this is something that I guess for me personally, my eyes kind of crossed trying to figure it out, but it could be that this kind of logic will make even better sense to you than, say, testing for true, which is what we have done. In each one of our previous examples, we've always said, well, here's the criteria, and then we always say, what happens if it's true first, and then we kind of decide what to do with the false piece. But what if you decide you need to test for false and then nest the true pieces? Well, that can be done as well. So let me just show you a short example of how that would work. Let me click here just to the right of our first temperature. We'll go to logical and then down to if. And our logical test, well, we'll start with B2. But we're going to say, is it less than or equal to H9? And H9 is here, 70 degrees. And we know that we need to click in front of the H and add in our absolute reference. So we'll press F4. Now, we're going to, for the moment, skip the value if true, but we're going to come down to what happens if it's false. Well, if it is false, I'm going to say that is I love today. Here's the problem. We actually have two possibilities for the true. It could be comfy or it could be burr. So in this case, I'm going to click where it says the value if true and go to the name box and get a new logical test. So for my next logical test, I'm going to say, okay, well, is B2 less than or equal to H6? And again, I need to put in my absolute reference using F4. Well, what is the value if true? Okay, so if B2 is less than H6, it's burr. But the value if false is comfy. And let's click OK. Now let's find the fill handle and click and drag down. And let's see if we actually figured that out correctly. Let's look just a bit here. 20 degrees we have as burr. And sure enough, according to our chart, it's burr. 52, the next choice here, we say is comfy. And according to the chart, that is comfy. The next one here, 72, we have as I love today. Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I love today is correct. The next piece is here, 52, 43, so a whole lot of them here in this middle range that are all in the 50s and 40s. are all designated as comfy, and that is correct. Then we go back to more cold conditions. So we have Burr here as 36 and 34. And yes, they are less than 40, so that is correct. And then 82 and 92, I love today as the last choices, and sure enough, that matches our chart. So let me come back and just click on that formula briefly because it looks a little bit different. If B2 is less than or equal to H9, and then it says, wait a minute, then we fill in the if B2 is less than H6, and if that is true, it's Burr, but then we get the comfy and the I love today at the end. So it looks a little bit different than our if we test straight up for true and then keep nesting the falses. But in fact, you can nest the true statements if that makes more sense to you, and it actually makes more sense for your spreadsheet and the kind of answers that you're looking for. To learn even more, be sure to go to mymcpl.org/online learning for such great resources as Universal Class, Learning Express Library, LinkedIn Learning, and Udemy Business. We also premiere videos every Wednesday and Friday at 1 o'clock. If you miss a video premiere, you'll still be able to find it later when it's convenient for you. You can find us on Facebook at MCPL 360, and you can find us on YouTube by going to our MCPL MO channel.